Welcome to Sci-Fi On Screen, the podcast that goes where no podcast has gone before. We here at Sci-Fi On Screen take a deep, close look at your favorite genre movies of science fiction, horror, fantasy, and comic book land. We go deep, scene by scene. We do comparisons of originals and remakes, and special shows. Just ahead, a new episode. And thanks for listening. Welcome back to another episode of Sci-Fi On Screen. I'm your host, Jeff Palermo. And this week, I'm going to be covering Luc Besson's 1997 space opera, The Fifth Element. And before I get to the film and the background, I just wanted to do a quick thank you to everyone who supports Sci-Fi On Screen via Patreon or via PayPal. Really appreciate your support. For those who don't know about PayPal, there'll be a spiel in the middle of this podcast talking about it, where you can support the show by podcast. So you can choose to donate as little as like $1 a show if you want to. You can turn it on, turn it off, change the amount whenever you want. I just wanted to welcome my mother, Anne, who's my latest supporter. Mom, thank you very much. It was really awesome that you are supporting the show. So just wanted to thank her and thank all of my longtime supporters out there. I am looking into some merch, which is kind of an interesting thing. So I'm hoping to have some stuff maybe in the next couple of months for different levels of folks who've contributed. So kind of want to show my appreciation a little more than just doing the show. So I'm not sure if that's going to work out, but I am looking into it and I'm hoping to get some of that stuff happening. So I just wanted to drop that a little bit. Okay, so let's do a little background about The Fifth Element. As a teenager, Luc Besson began writing this script. He was basically 16, which was back in 1975, though the movie was not released until he was 38 years old. The original storyline was set in the year 2300, and it was about a nobody named Zaltman Bleros, of course later renamed Corbin Dallas, who wins a trip to the Club Med resort on the planet Fluston Paradise. There he meets Lilu, a sand girl who has the beauty of youth despite being over 2,000 years old. So that was kind of the basic thrust. That the last act of the film was something that had popped up to him when he was a teenager, and he basically continued to tweak and work on the storyline year by year by year. Finally had it made and released in 1997. A little bit of the pre-production background. In November 1991, while looking for actors for this film, Luc Besson met French comic creator Jean Girard and Jean-Claude Mézières and recruited them for the film's production design. And I think those comics were like in the 70s, kind of like the heavy metal comics, heavy metal magazine, right? So there's another famous French comic artist named Mobius who's also doing stuff. So a lot of the inspiration for this film and for a lot of other film actually came from a lot of these French comic book writers. This guy Mézières wrote the book The Circles of Power, which contained a character named Strax, who drives a flying taxicab through the congested air traffic of a city on this planet of Rubanus. Mézières showed the images of this flying taxi to Luc Besson, who was inspired to change the background of Dallas from a worker in a rocket ship factory, which was, very retro, to that of a taxi driver who flies his cab around this futuristic New York. 5 other artists were hired for the project, and of course, world-renowned and famous designer Jean-Paul Gaultier was hired to design the costumes. The team spent a year creating about 8,000 drawings, during which time Besson approached both Bruce Willis at the time and Mel Gibson for the lead role of Corbin Dallas. Willis expressed interest, though he was reluctant to take on the role as the film was considered risky, probably by his agents, after his previous 2 films didn't do well, Hudson Hawk and Billy Bathgate. Mel Gibson turned down the role, and while the team seemed to impress film companies with the designs, they struggled to find a company willing to bank them for $100 million, which, in 1991 was still a boatload of money. And so in 92, pretty much everything dropped. So at that point, Luc Besson went on to direct this film called Leon the Professional with Natalie Portman and the awesome Jean Reno. I love Jean Reno. That came out in 1994. And while shooting and releasing it, he continued to tweak The Fifth Element script, shortening it and reducing the budget to $90 million before attempting to find a studio willing to produce it. Columbia Pictures, who had a partnership in The Professional, agreed to finance the film, and by this time, Besson had decided to go with a lesser-known lead actor in order to save on production costs. So Besson was in somebody's office when Bruce Willis called to speak about a different film. Besson basically asked to speak to Willis just to say hello, and he told him that The Fifth Element was finally going ahead, telling him that he was going with a less expensive actor. And after a brief pause, Willis stated, if I like the film, we can always come to an arrangement, which means he would take a lesser salary. So basically, he read the script and decided to do it. Production started in August 1995. Besson traveled to a bunch of places for casting, Paris, London, and Rome. He hired Gary Oldman, and Gary Oldman basically took the part unseen, having not read anything, because Besson had financed Oldman's, I think his directorial debut, Nil by Mouth. So Oldman felt obligated at that point. He was a burgeoning star as well. So as soon as Besson called, he basically said yes. And in later interviews now, he hates the film, but he did it straight up as a favor to Luc Besson. And for Lilu, there were like 200 to 300 actresses who who tried, and he chose this complete unknown Milla Jovovich to play the part. Jean-Paul Gaultier designed pretty much every one of the 900 costumes worn by the extras in the Fhloston Paradise scenes, and he checked each costume every morning. His designs, described as, quote, intellectually transgressive, end quote, were said to challenge sexuality and gender norms. And a single jacket he designed for the film cost $5,000. I'm not sure what jacket it was, but so yeah, it was a big deal. I remember even back then in the trailer, that they were touting him as the costume designer. Pretty cool. Very rarely do you hear of a famous outre designer doing something for a film and it being part of the promotion. So I kind of thought that was neat. Okay, so kind of some background stuff, and I'm going to just jump right in to The Fifth Element. And we get a prologue in this film. We open with this massive ship approaching Earth orbit, and we see something detach and descend. And we get a title card, Egypt 1914. So this whole opening is at this Egyptian dig, and we are with these two characters, this professor and his young assistant Billy, played by Luke Perry. And they're in this temple trying to decipher these hieroglyphics. We get this first idea as they're transcribing them about these 5 elements, and we see them point to a little bit on the map. There are these 4 elements that look like these little stones, and then a person in the middle, so we're getting an initial tease of the story. Some priest who now mutters that they know too much, tries to poison the water that they're drinking, but fails as the water is tossed away. And then we see these wonderful aliens who we didn't see them in person when the ship dropped from the sky, but now they enter the temple. They're called the Mondo Shawans, and they are wonderfully designed. It's kind of like looping potato head men. They're these very round creatures that even when they walk, they sway from side to side, and they have these huge sloping shoulders and these little heads that look like kind of Cylons that pop out from just below their shoulders. Really wonderful design. I love these aliens, and they look really good. They don't look fake. They look really neat. And the voices are terrific, obviously affected voices, but very well done. And, all practical effects from what I can tell. This was before CGI, really went wild. CGI was happening, but it wasn't in everything. So Besson definitely did some good practical effects here. They say some lines about the stones are not safe on Earth, and they open this chamber, and inside we see these 5 elements, and we see these 4 stones, which they put in a case. And we see a sarcophagus, which they wheel out on some cool anti-grav mechanism. The aliens basically tell the priest in 300 years when evil returns, they will come back with all of this stuff. Billy freaks out and winds up shooting one of them, and the doors close automatically, and so one of the Mondo Shawans remains behind, and the last thing we see is his hand before it's crushed by the walls. He gives the priest this key, which is the key to that chamber, should they need to get in 300 years. So we get our prologue, and the prologue is really neat, very Stargate-y, if you will, and Indiana Jones-ish. Really cool setup. I love, even as it starts, I love these aliens. Getting the tease about the 5 elements, it happens very briskly and seriously. I kind of like it. The one thing about this film that really will go haywire as we go along is the tone. The tone changes. Oh my God, this movie is a tonal mess. as much as I have a fondness for it, as I will narrate going forward. But this initial opening is a real kicker, and it's really serious and strange and cool. So we get a title card. 300 years later, we are with the Earth Force Fleet. I don't even know what they're really called. I don't think they named them, but we're with these Star Cruisers that are very Star Wars, Star Destroyer-ish. I think they're models, and they look really cool. They hold up, I think, pretty well. I saw a remastered version of this, so if you guys are interested in rewatching this at some point, I would recommend the remastered version because things look really good. And the space effects, especially, they did a really good job on them, and they hold up, I think. So basically, we're seeing this black orb heading for Earth. Very simple, very simple plot. The Earth Cruiser is interdicting, is in front of it. And we're getting this encounter. And so now we've got some new players on the scene. We have this general who's played by the guy who played Leon in Blade Runner, who's a little bit older. And we have the president of the Federation, I guess, who's played by the guy in The Dark Knight who was on the prison barge, who near the end of the movie walks up to the guy and says, give it to me. I'll tell them you took it by force. And then throws the detonator out the window. That guy is the president in this movie. I didn't know it, never really knew it. And this time when I saw it, I'm like, wait a minute, I know that guy. So kind of a cool little, genre connection made there. So the president's monitoring this confluence that's happening, and we see these three clerics arrive, and we are introduced to Vito Cornelius, played by the redoubtable Ian Holm, who I also love, who's very good in this, mostly. And he knows what it is. And he describes the thing as pure evil and anti-life. And he warns that aggression by the Earth forces will only strengthen it. And, of course, we see a brief battle sequence where they fire a bunch of missiles into it. And all it does is expand and destroys the ship. And Cornelius tells the president that they've got about 48 hours until the orb adapts to Earth's living conditions and destroys all life. However, he then goes on to tell the president about the Mondo Shawans and about the weapon that was made to defeat this. And as they speak, this Mondo Shawan ship is entering the solar system on its way to Earth to, fight the good fight. And then we see it moments later. We cut to them, and we recognize them as the aliens from the prologue. They're on their way, and then these fighters come out of nowhere, piloted by these really cool sort of dog-headed aliens called the Mangalores. They're really neat looking, and the effects are really good. I don't know how much is practical and how much is CGI, but they still look good. They got these huge, thick lips and these big floppy ears, and I just like them. They're just really cool-looking aliens. They got these really grovelly voices, and they're kind of shapeshifters, too. They can become people, sometimes easier than others, as we'll get to a couple of scenes down the road. They destroy the Mondo Shawan ship, basically driving it into one of our, I guess, moons or planets, and it's seemingly destroyed, and we hear that it is, and we see Cornelius sink down to his knees, thinking like, all is lost. Now, we cut to our intro of our hero, Corbin Dallas, played kind of smirkingly by Bruce Willis. He kind of waltzes through this thing. He has a couple of moments where I feel like he's doing his job, but he in his earlier days, he really kind of smirked his way through a lot of films. I'm a fan of his, but back in the day, he was really kind of quasi-obnoxious sometimes, but he's not totally that in this movie. But he is kind of like smirking through a lot of it. But he is good, and he looks the part, and he's the chiseled hero we need him to be. So he wakes up in this really sci-fi apartment. There are some really fun things here in this scene. He's trying to quit smoking, so this machine spits out like 5 cigarettes for him every morning, and each day the amount of tobacco in the things are smaller and the amount of filter is larger, which is kind of fun. It's really like a cube hotel more than anything. We hear the kind of very retrograde and absurd theme of this movie, which is Corbin Dallas wants the perfect woman, right? How very French. We find out as he's speaking to the guy who actually owns the cab that he drives, he was an ex-space pilot, ex-Marine, right? So, we're setting him up. So when he does his bits later on, we know that he was in the service. We see a brief advertisement here in his cubicle of Flossin Paradise, which is what's going to end up near the end of the film. A smidgen of Chris Tucker's Ruby Rod. And then we have this moment of this guy tries to rob him. So someone knocks on his door. He opens it up, and it's this guy who's really whacked out on something and wants his money or wants stuff from him. And he plays it really, really cool and basically takes the weapon from the guy and shoos him away. Once this scene happened, I was struck by a few things. So the giant black orb coming to Earth, Bruce Willis as this cabbie who gets the drop on people who try to kill him. Those are 3 elements from one of the segments of the animated sci-fi movie called Heavy Metal that came out in 1981. So about 6 years after Mr. Besson had tried to start his script, right? And many, many years before the film came out. So there's a lot of cross-pollination here. The Heavy Metal magazine also featured often artists like Mobius and these other French guys who were doing kind of fantastic science fiction and heavy metal comic art. So there was stuff in heavy metal, and I would imagine that Besson, being a young man, probably read some of that stuff. So in the film version of the Heavy Metal magazine, which basically is an anthology, which I have fond feelings for. It's kind of a mess, but there's some really nice rotoscoping in it. There are some things that are really cool. The coolest use of Black Sabbath's and Mob Rules that I've ever seen. Great soundtrack. Sammy Hagar, heavy metal songs in it. So really cool soundtrack. Some really good rotoscope stuff. Some dumb sequences as well, but it was kind of a landmark when it came out. Thinking about covering it, I don't know that I have too much to say about it. There are 4 or 5 sequences, and some of them are really gruesome. They didn't, there's a lot of nudity, there's sex, there's blood. It's an R-rated animated film, on science fiction and horror themes, which is really 1981. Strangely enough, though, in 1981, there was this brief thing of you had, not in 81, but in the 70s and going into the 80s, you had Ralph Bakshi's Wizards, Lord of the Rings. You had American Pie, which was an animated film about the music industry. You had Heavy Metal. I think there was Fire and Ice was another one. And they were mostly rotoscoped, which is basically, I think, you have a body in motion, and then, they're putting cell animation over a human body doing stuff. So it has this kind of almost stop motion quality to it. And if you go back and watch some of these things, even the Lord of the Rings one, they still kind of hold up because there's something uncanny about the rotoscoping that makes it, I don't know, it just makes it very artistic, and it's still neat to watch. So there was a brief spate of these movies. They pretty much died out, I think, in the early 80s, or maybe they went to the mid-80s, but then it kind of died. But there was a cool adult animated film era in this country in the late 70s. So just something to share because I thought it was really neat. So to finish my point, I think Besson's borrowing elements from this. It's kind of again, he's working with some of the artists who contributed to those magazines who made these things. But at the same time, in the Heavy Metal film, there is a sequence where this black orb is it's really behind the scenes in all of the bits in the movie. And then at the end, it's the hero, this Tarna, versus the Black Sphere, right? And one of the bits in it is about this cab driver who drives a cab, and when people try to rob him, he's got this ray that he shines on him and disintegrates them. So I just was thinking he definitely cribbed some stuff from Heavy Metal. So if anyone's interested to screen Heavy Metal, I think you'll see what I'm talking about, and folks who know it, I think you get it. All right, so back to our story. Once the Mondo Shaolin ship is destroyed, Ugnaught, who's basically, I want to say Ugnaught, I think it's Aknot, but it sounds like Star Wars Ugnaughts, right? Is the Mangalore leader, contacts this main bad guy, Jean-Baptiste Zorg, and we don't really see Zorg in full face yet. It's really just from the back, and we just see his cool costume that he's got on. He's the one who hired these guys to steal these 5 elements. And so we're getting our first little tease of our bad guy. Now we're back. The Federation recovers the hand of the 5th element, and it's this huge monster hand. It looks like it's going to be this monster warrior because it's a glove, and it's the ring of the case of the stones, right? But the stones are gone, just the hand. And so in this medical chamber, they reconstruct the entire body from the leftover cells, as every cell in your body is a roadmap to your entire system. So, it's scientifically feasible. So I kind of like that. And we see this medical chamber, the costumes that the folks are wearing kind of reminded me a little bit of the Dune costumes and this weird vinyl stuff that they've got on, and their faces were really unsavory. And then we watch the process, and they do it really well. First, we see the underlying bone constructed. Then we see this layer of muscle go on, and then, because it's somewhat of a PG movie, they put the cover down. They come up with this notion of they have to bathe the body in ultraviolet rays to kickstart growth, right? That's a clever little bit of writing to get out of showing nudity, right? It finishes, and there's this wonderful dramatic reveal once they put the, quote, thermal bandages on Ms. Jovovich's body, where she is revealed. And she's terrific here, actually. She's one of the strong points in this movie because she's so convicted. She's just really in every scene, and she speaks the language great. physically, she's in the scene. Some of the fight scenes near the end, maybe not so much. You know, we really hadn't gotten into really awesome fight scenes yet in American cinema, or cinema in general, I should say. But man, she really throws herself into the role. And one little bit of trivia is that she was often covered with black and blue from some of the more physical scenes. And there was a little aside. Bruce Willis was basically like, "Hey, girl, take it easy. You know, this is all make-believe, right?" Which is perfectly him, right? Come on. It's some goofy sci-fi show. Let's just get through it and go grab a beer, right? But it shows because she is really larger than life in most of this. And yes, she's ridiculously hot, but I think she actually does a great job in her physical performance. So she easily breaks out, demonstrating how strong she is, but also how smart she is, which I like. Police guards go after her. They've got these really bulky shields on their back, and they've got these helmets that they almost look like little Judge Dredd helmets. I wonder if they were, because Judge Dredd was in 2000 AD, which was a big comic back in the day, and I'm wondering if some of that was influenced by the visual folks. But the cops really look cool in their outfits. And then once we get outside, we realize how much George Lucas stole from this film, because the exterior of New York is really like Coruscant. The layer of detail in it is pretty astounding. Even so, I mean, they must have spent a good deal of money on this. And it's the whole deal with the cars, the layers of cars all flying, or in traffic patterns and all that, which is totally George cribbed this. And if he said he didn't, he's got to be lying. And it's that moment in sci-fi history when one of the Godfathers is starting to steal from the enfant terribles, you know what I mean, when you go forward. So it's kind of an interesting moment. Cars are weird. The cars almost don't look real. They've tried to do a little bit of futuristic versus retro. Like the flying cars in Blade Runner look great because it's Ridley and his production designer, so they look real. They look lived in. These cars look like, the kind of tin cars that, kids played with in 1940. They don't look that great. Which is kind of a shame because everything around them looks fantastic. And so we have the scene between Dallas and Lilu because she jumps out of this window and lands in his cab, which is how they meet, right? And immediately the cops are all around him and he's got to give up. He's like, "Sorry, honey, there's nothing I can do." And so she sees a little sign in the back of his cab that says, "Please." And so she learns English, and she's learned a bit of English already because she's super smart. She really pleads with him, and she's crying. He basically makes a run for it with her in the cab. And what's interesting is when they did this scene with her speaking to him and trying to get him to take her away from there, Willis wasn't told what her dialogue lines were, and she was speaking in the language that her and Luc Besson made up. So the scene there is basically kind of ad-libbed, and there's an ad-lib line that Willis says, "Look, lady, I only speak two languages, English and bad English," which he ad-libbed, and they left it in. But his reaction in trying to find out what she was talking about was genuine. I thought that was kind of cool.
This is the 24th century. Material needs no longer exist.
As lovely a dream as that is, which is why I love Trek so much, it is still the 21st century, and monetary needs are unfortunately still very much with us. And I just want to tell you briefly some ways you can support Sci-Fi on Screen. One way is to subscribe to Patreon.com. And Patreon is very good for podcasters because you can sign up with Patreon and you can choose to donate as little as $1 per episode. And so every time I actually upload an episode, you would get debited. And you can change the amount whenever you like. You can stop whenever you like. So, you're not just giving money indiscriminately per month or per week. Only when I put up a show do you contribute. There's also PayPal. If you want to do a one-time donation, you can go to PayPal, use sci-fi-on-screen@gmail.com, email address, and you can donate from there. And non-monetary ways to support the podcast, please share the show on your Facebook page, retweet it, tell your friends, skywrite it, name a star after it, if you will. Do a review on iTunes, just kind of get the word out. And I have a dream someday of making this my sole source of income. And I think, sometimes when I have several thousand downloads of a show, I thought, well, if every person who downloaded that show, donated $1, I wouldn't have a day job. So just putting that in people's hats. And if you can't afford it, please just enjoy the show.
Gonna crack my knuckles and jump for joy. I got a clean bill of health from Dr. McCoy.
So they get away. The chase is kind of boring. I mean, in terms of, sci-fi action chases, it's not that great, But she asks for Cornelius. So there's the connection. So she knows who he is. And we cut right to Cornelius, and they go there, and he sees the tattoo on her arm and knows immediately who she is. And then there's this pre-Me Too moment where she's sleeping, and they're in Cornelius's place, and he's in the other room getting his wardrobe sorted out. And Dallas leans in for a kiss. It's like, ugh. And she immediately wakes up and draws a gun on him, and she's like all over him, very disgusted with him, and we kind of are too, actually. And it's funny when sometimes you see these older films, you realize what men could get away with and what was considered okay in terms of sexuality, masculinity, whatever. And so it's funny, these little artifacts that are going to pop up as now things are really changing in this day and age, and you see them pop up in the film, which is like, oh, okay. And they talk to it a little bit. So before he leaves, then basically they throw him out. And he says, I didn't understand what she said, and what was the one word that she used? Ectogamete, and the priest says, never without my permission, right? So we're getting a little bit of, okay, she doesn't like him, but it's like still calling her out for being creepy, and, maybe next time if you ask, maybe I'll grant you the permission, which I don't know. It's kind of a little, very before its time. It's very retrograde in one way, and then before its time a little bit in the other, which I kind of like. Then, Dallas is a little bit redeemed back in his apartment, regretting I should have never kissed her, but it's still kind of like, yeah, it doesn't quite work. But anyway, there's some real seriousness about him being smitten with her. Like, she's the perfect girl, and it's absurd. It's just like, this ridiculous idea of, this romantic notion of she's the perfect woman. That's kind of absurd. But the film is just too wackadoo now. The tones are starting to shift, and some of the stuff that's happening for me to really buy anybody doing anything seriously, except for Lilu, because she is kind of set apart from the cast in the film by the nature of her character, but also by the nature of her performance. Yeah, so that was interesting. So then there's this moment where Lilu learns human history. She basically goes into something, I guess the internet was kind of in its infancy in 97. And it's basically war and violence. And we see her eating like 10 plates of food. She's very cute, kind of bustling around the apartment, just completely at home and unaffected by what's going on around her. And then we get this little bit of a cut back and forth where we find out what happened to the stones. So first she says to Cornelius and his buddy, the stones were stolen. And then we cut to Zorg's, where he's meeting the Mangalores to get the stones that he paid them to steal. And he looks really cool. This is the first reveal of Zorg. He's got this great costume with this high collar that comes up and this suit that he's wearing, and he's got this weird plastic thing over half of his skull. He looks, and a little soul patch on his chin. He looks great. I really like the costume. Uknot comes in to the meeting in human disguise, and Zorg says, I don't like that. I want to see your real self. As he shakes his head, and the human head goes from that to the Mangalore actual head. It's a cool effect. I still really like it. I really like the Mangalores here. Zorg has kind of a half Southern, half something accent. It's really weird. I'm not really sure if it works or not, but it is what it is. So the notion is that Zorg is going to sell him these weapons, and basically the weapon that he's selling is this super gun that he's got, and it does all these crazy things. One of the buttons is a replay button, so if you hit your target with one bullet and you hit replay, no matter where you point the gun, everything else swings around and goes back to that one spot. Kind of neat. And then he just starts showing them off. It's got a flamethrower, it's got a net, it's got, the fog and smoke, and it's like these super guns. And so he sees the case, he opens the case, he shuts it. Many red herrings about where the stones are in this film, and the case is empty. And we cut back at that moment to Lilu, who's in the middle of laughing. They planned the stones to be in a different ship, and she's already looking for her contact. It's going to be this opera singer who's going to be singing a concert on none other than Lost in Paradise, this pleasure planet. So we got the little fake out, and then back to Zorg, who basically takes his weapon back, leaves them one case full of weapons. But when he walks out, there's this little joke of like, I never told them what that red button was for. We see the Mangalores all gathered around, and they push it, and basically they all explode and kills them. So we also find out that Zorg had visited Cornelius earlier, and so he gets Cornelius brought to his office. There's a little bit of they try to do a little bit of, good dialogue here. Basically, Zorg's whole spiel about what he does, since he's an arms dealer. So he throws a a glass off of his desk. And as soon as the glass breaks, all these little robot drones, not unlike the Roomba, which came out, a few years ago, all come out and they clean up the glass. His notion is that, he's not evil, but war is good for business, right? That the more war is promoted, that it brings jobs. It's kind of a cool bad guy spiel. I always feel like if you're going to do a bad guy spiel and you're going to do bad guy motivation, there's plenty of things that you can have a bad guy into that are, that you as the audience member could relate to on a bad day. You know what I mean? So I like that. I like that they do that because you're like, yeah, I kind of get it, right? As Zorg is eating something, he gets a cherry pit caught in his throat and he's choking to death and all his minions are outside and only Cornelius is there. And now Cornelius' turn to talk about what's important. And he's like, all your money and all these weaponry and all this stuff, and what you really need is a good old human being in this moment, and he lets him choke for a while and then finally hits him in the back and he spits out the cherry pit, which spares his life. So Cornelius is sent away and Zorg now tasks his men with finding the stones. We see that one of his guys has this remote control cockroach that's in the president's chamber. Overhears the president talking about the stones on their way to Fhloston Paradise. So we all kind of know, everybody now knows where they're going, and the chase is on. So we rejoin Corbin Dallas, still home, and I really like this scene. It looks like he's sitting at a yakitori stall, getting dumplings, very Blade Runner-ish. And we're not sure he's home. We're not sure he's at the stall. It's kind of a weird moment. And then when his phone rings, the yakitori stall was actually a floating stall and it floats away. So I really like that little sight gag. He discovers now that he's won a trip to Fhloston Paradise from his mother, who basically calls. There's this whole inside kind of funny, bizarre thing between him and this woman who calls. She's uncredited, so we don't know really who she is, but she's like, "Oh, Corbin, you never call your mother." She's got this kind of New York accent. It's throughout the whole movie. At one point, it's even later in the movie at the end, talking to the president. So from her, he finds out that he won this contest. And again, it's another part of how wonky the tone is in this movie. And we haven't even gotten to where the tone starts to go haywire. Like, at this point, there are kind of fun, goofy moments, and then it's serious. There's fun, goofy moments, then it's serious. But once we get to Fhloston, it's on. It's like, forget about it. So General Monroe visits him, and he's recalled officially from service. So, we've heard about this earlier. He is sent after the stones, and the contest was, of course, rigged so he can go. And he's given the 2 tickets. Lilu then arrives, and there's some kind of really madcap stuff where Lilu and Cornelius are there. He's got to hide the military guys because I guess they're still after her, right? So he hides them in these places in his apartment. It's just kind of dumb. Cornelius has a gun, and he threatens Corbin, and he takes the tickets because he's going to go with Lilu. And then the police arrive at the housing block. And there's another little reference here that made me think. When the cops come to the housing block, they do this thing where everyone who lives in the housing block has to put their hands on these yellow circles inside their house, and then they're scanned from outside by the cops. Made me think that maybe the folks who wrote Minority Report got this, because it reminded me of the scene in Minority Report where they throw those spiders up in that housing project, and the spiders go through every housing block and every apartment, and they actually go in the apartment and scan people's eyes. But I don't know, it felt similar to me, and I think this movie's been kind of influential. I think it influenced George, which is no small thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if it influenced the writing of that film, because it just made me think of that scene. So then I think either the general or somebody moved Dallas's name from his cubicle to another cubicle. So the cops come to the housing block now. Again, they're asking people to put their hands on the circles, but they go to the wrong apartment, and the guy who's in that apartment is jumpy, and he gets killed, and they think he's Corbin Dallas. And it turns out that Zorg has tipped off the cops about where Corbin lived. So they think it's him. And so the whole plan, everyone's plan basically is to impersonate Corbin Dallas, steal the tickets, and go to Fhloston Paradise. As soon as this one guy dies, the Mangalores arrive. They kill all the cops, steal the body, because they plan on impersonating him. So there's this, it's getting more and more madcap now as we go. So Cornelius knocks Dallas out. He takes Lilu and the tickets, and Dallas pursues. So now we get to the airport. And he's going to send this young acolyte with Lilu. When they're up at the station, Corbin arrives and basically shoves the young guy aside. And so he and Lilu, via the tickets, get on and they're set. And then right after them, the Mangalores come in human disguise. They tell the folks that it's their Corbin Dallas and they don't get in. And then later on, one of Zorg's men comes and says, I'm Corbin Dallas, right? So this is a little bit of a gag, which is just, I don't know, it's kind of dull. So now we get the introduction of Ruby Rhod, who's my least favorite part of this film. Chris Tucker does what, I'm sure Luc Besson wanted him to do, and he's just out of his mind. His costume, of course, is outrageous, and he's got this weird kind of pompadour hairdo, and he just looks like, Mozart meets Rockwell, if you remember Rockwell from the 80s. I think somebody's watching me, right? So it's just a weird, it's an outlandish look, and it is what it is. But I don't really, the whole Ruby Rhod thing, it's so over the top, and there's almost this mini music video as we follow Ruby Rhod through this huge floating hotel ship as he, introduces himself and everyone else that's there, and it's just like, okay, so now, we're really getting. This film is really starting to go bonkers. Then there's this fun moment. We hear some reggae in the background, and there's this crew of Jamaicans fueling the ship, and they're killing what look like tribbles, parasites that are on the ship. It's just, I don't know. It's kind of cool. Some of these moments, at times, I feel are very Terry Gilliam-esque, and I think maybe Gilliam was, somehow a visual influence on some of this stuff, because some of it does kind of remind me of David Lynch's Dune, which also had a kind of Gilliam feel to it. But, yeah, some of the costumes and some of the weirdness here, it feels very Gilliam, actually. So now we get this moment where we realize that Zorg is in contact with this floating orb, and his secretary says Mr. Shadow is on the line, right? So as this shadow is threatening Zorg because it wants the stones, he starts bleeding from his forehead, which is really creepy. And again, tonally, light years away from the previous Ruby Rhod sequence. So now we're really wonking here. So now Flossed in Paradise, which is this basically pleasure jungle planet, and there's a brief scene with this mysterious diva who arrives and who's incidentally played by an actress who was at the time Luc Besson's wife. Luc Besson left her during the production of this film to be with his perfect girl, Milla Jovovich, and they basically divorced 2 years later. So, it's interesting when you kind of get a little bit of what's on the director's mind, right? She's very cool looking. The makeup is really neat, and she's a really interesting presence in this film. Again, flipping back to a very uncanny and kind of kooky and creepy thing from the madcap stuff that we just were witnessing. And she tells Lilu, who knows they know each other, I'll give you the stones after my concert, which is like, why don't you just give them to her now? This thing's hurtling toward Earth. They're right there in your room. You're going to give it to them for the opera. So, I mean, where they get the stones, basically, at the end, maybe she kind of had a sense she was going to die. I don't know. But so now we get this performance, and the first part of this aria is stunning and beautiful. And Besson nicely just gives us this whole aria. It's like a 2-minute sequence of just her singing, and it's quite beautiful. Again, tonally, totally out of course with the Ruby Rhod stuff, the Jamaicans fueling the ship. It's just beautiful. It belongs in another movie. But it's part of this one. It's actually an aria from an opera called Lucia di Lammermoor, written by Donizetti. And her costume kind of reminded me of a bit of Bib Fortuna from the Star Wars universe, with these things coming out of her head. And then the aria ends, and then it becomes kind of a rockified at the end, and they use her voice in a sampler, which is not so great. But it's a beautiful moment when you hear that aria, so I got to give it to Besson for that. So during this, Zorg arrives, saying, if you want something done, you better do it yourself. So he's on point now. In this diva's room, the Mangalores try to take the stones, but Lilu interrupts them, and she kind of comes forward now as this supreme being, fighting machine, and the fight choreography is horrible, and it's very dated. And she does take them out, and at some point, Zorg intercepts her. He gets the stones, and he uses his super weapon on her, and she is now up in some duct, seriously wounded, so she's kind of out of the fight. And then the Mangalores kind of want to take over the ship, and they start opening fire, and the diva is killed during this. So she's wounded, and she dies, I think, at some later point. But so now, another fake out, right? Zorg thinks the stones are in another box. He goes to open it, and he's stymied. And as the diva is dying, Dallas is there, and the stones are actually within her body. So she is dead, and you see, Dallas actually sticking a hand in the gunshot wound, tearing her open, getting the stones out. So just bizarre, like just out of nowhere. So now Corbin, becomes the man. He's on the rampage, and he's killing these Mangalores, and He gives Ruby the stones to hold. It's again, some of this is pretty cool. Some of it's madcap. And then there's a huge explosion at the end, which I think was one of the biggest special effects explosions at the time that ever was conceived in this space, which is kind of cool. But again, it's late 90s action, which, depending on what movie you're in, could be either okay or, pretty bad. So Lilu is close to death. She is found and taken. Zorg had planted a time bomb, which is ticking to go off. So now there's pandemonium. The ship's being evacuated. Lifeboats ejecting. The end of Zorg is kind of really weird. Corbin steals Zorg's ship and takes off. Zorg gets to Diva's room where he sees his own timer counting down, and he puts a little slot in it, and it stops at like 5 seconds to go. And then we cut to one of the Mangalores wakes up, and he says, "For honor," presses a button. And in the same room, another little machine opens up. That's a bomb. And we see this other readout that starts at 5 and counts down to 1. So it was just kind of a bizarre moment. And it explodes. The hotel is decimated. Zorg is killed, but they all escape. So now we have this escalation. We're on the ship with Lilu and Ruby Rhod and Dallas and Cornelius. Lilu looks up the history of war. I guess we get this notion that she was looking up the history of our race by letters. So she finally gets the W. She looks up war, and we see this montage of film of all famous wars that we know about, and she's crying. And again, it's a very back to this very intense thematic moment of like, will she save humanity because of what we do? And it's like, really? In this movie? Like Jovovich sells it as usual. She's crying. I totally buy it. But Ruby Rhod's in the same scene. It's so wonky. So now we're at the temple, the end, right back in the chamber where we started in the prologue, and some Indiana Jones stuff happens, right? The stones need to be placed on these plinths, and they don't know how to open the stone. So this is kind of clever. They're all walking around. The orb is, descending to earth, and, they're in trouble, and they don't know how to open the stones. And then we see the acolyte frustrated trying to open one, and he breathes out, and we see the stone react. Something starts. And then they all gather around, and they ask him to say whatever he said, and he does, and nothing happens, and then he exhales again, and finally Dallas puts it together. Wind for wind, fire for fire, air for air, fire for fire, water for water. I really love this part. They put a little dirt on one, it activates. Cornelius takes sweat from his brow and squeezes it onto the other. That one activates. They put dirt on one, and then the last one is fire, and Dallas has one match left, and he barely gets it lit, and so they're all set. And then they're in the center. Lilu is basically dying, and Dallas brings her to the center, and she's like, "Why should I save you? All you do is destroy, destroy, destroy," which, again, tonally in this film is like, really? So he says, well, some things are worth saving, like love, right? And he says, "I love you." So it's thematically clever, right? In a way, because she's the supreme being warrior, right? The things that were needed to open the other 4 elements, she also needed something, and it was love, and it came from Dallas. So, schematically, I thought, that's clever, and I'm not buying it really very much. And then it's a very anticlimactic ending. He loves her, they kiss, the stones activate, she shoots fire out of her mouth, kills the planet, which turns into a dead orb, and we're done. So it's really, really weird. And then we're in this like James Bond Moonraker ending. They're both in the revivification chamber where she's being revived, but I guess he's in there with her, and the president's there, like he wants to give him an award. And I think they're attempting re-entry, sir, which is the Bond movie, remember? They were doing, him and Mrs. Goodhead were having sex in the space shuttle, so it was really weird. And, in the very end, we see Corbin Dallas with his perfect woman, right? And we're out. So, brief summary. I mean, I like Fifth Element. I think the way I kind of like Flash Gordon. It's fun. The special effects, I think, really hold up. It's cool to watch. Some of the action sequences are okay. I like the Mangalores. Jovovich is terrific. New York City is great. So maybe I like the production design more. And it's lighthearted. The thing moves. I don't really buy into the more darker or heavier notes that come into it, but every 6 or 7 years, I tend to be like, let me watch it again. And I do, and it's fun. And I find it fun each time. I wouldn't defend it as this successful thing, but it's this odd tonal layer cake that of sci-fi stuff that I have a little bit of an affection for, but I don't think it works in one hand, and on the other hand, since I keep coming back to it, some part of it kind of does work. So it's really odd. So that's all I've got to say about The Fifth Element, and I'll see you next time.